So I've been making a lot of Dune Awakening videos, and I've been pretty positive over a majority of the information I've gone over, primarily because I just like this style of survival games, the more empire builder style that pretty much started by Ark Survival Evolved, that went into Conan Exiles, into Myth of Empires, into a long line of survival games that are built with those aspects, where it generally has a lot more permanence. Instead of something like a weekly rest wipe, you may have wipes that are months or even something like 6 months, or some servers even longer, where you're kind of just in this much more continuous survival world building your empire. And Dune Awakening seems to be following a lot of those similar aspects, but one of the big areas that I think is probably gonna be the weakest of Dune Awakening is going to be its combat. And before we get into why I think the combat's going to be the weakest part of the game, to be fair, I will say that pretty much all of those other survival games that I mentioned also don't have the best combat. Ark Survival Evolved, even though it's possibly the most popular out of that style of survival games, probably has a worse combat. Some of the most floaty, least impact gameplay I've had in pretty much any game I played, even though I have over 4,500 hours in that game. So while the combat is just generally not good, I think so many other parts of the game are just so good and addictive to play that you kind of look past the combat. And it's also going to be kind of similar in Dune Awakening to Ark, because even though your kind of base on foot combat isn't very good, I think the mounted dinosaur combat was actually better than the normal combat when you weren't on a dinosaur. So you also had a lot of that was generally a bit better. I think it might be a similar thing in Dune Awakening, because not only are you going to have the combat when you're on foot, where you can use melee abilities or weapons, but you're also then going to have a vehicle combat, and it seems like the vehicle combat is going to be better and generally more interesting. Now, the on-foot combat can be split into 3 different categories. You have shooting, so you have your range weapons, you have your melee weapons, and then you have your abilities. Because Dune Awakening does have some RPG elements. You have a handful of different skill trees that have a bunch of different abilities and passives, where you can use 2 normal abilities at a time with one kind of ultimate skill that's at the end of the skill trees. And then you also have 3 different passives you can also use, and depending on what skills or passives they are, they can also be upgraded to become more powerful. And then on top of that, you're also going to have gear and the actual different weaponry you're using that's also going to have its own stats and potentially some special effects on them. So while I think the Dune Awakening combat in general is going to be the weakest part, I think some parts are going to be a lot weaker than others. And more specifically, I think the melee combat looks to be the weakest. It just looks the worst when it comes to animations, when it comes to how clunky it looks, and it does also generally just look a bit slow. Now, there is actually a reason and an actual lore reason for that. Obviously, in the Dune universe, you have shielding. More specifically, when you get to higher tier enemies, when you get further into the game, you'll start to come across AI with better shielding, and you'll start to come across players in PvP that will also have better shielding. Now, a big thing in Dune is that you can't really use bullets against that shielding because they move too fast. They won't penetrate the shield. So you need something maybe like darts, which are a lot of weapons use darts, to have a slower projectile to try to penetrate the shield. But it also seems that even with those darts, some shielding you just won't be able to penetrate. So you'll need to use a melee weapon, and you'll need to use some type of slow attack to pierce through that shielding and defeat that enemy. And I think this is also one of the areas where the melee combat doesn't look the best, because when you have a kind of janky animation of a super slow penetrating attack with a melee weapon, it may make sense in lore, but it doesn't look very good, and it probably doesn't feel super good either. So I think melee is actually going to be the weakest part of the Dune Awakening combat, which probably isn't the best thing, because Dune as a universe, in let's say a majority of the Dune universe, melee weapons are just significantly more important. In a lot of places, you will rarely or never see just like normal guns. On Arrakis, it's a bit different because those shields do attract sandworms, so there would be much more ranged weapons or guns being used in the lore in general. And then you have the modified lore of Dune Awakening, where after someone shot a shield with, I'm pretty sure, a las gun, it blew up and caused a nuclear explosion, which is actually what happens in the official Dune lore. So after that, there was a rule implemented where any of those weapons that could cause that effect when shooting a shield now just turn off and won't allow you to shoot those types of shields. So that is some of the changed lore for Dune Awakening. We're not able to just shoot shields and cause nuclear explosions. And I think the next up of the rung of combat of Dune Awakening is going to be shooting. And it does seem like this game is more primarily going to be a third-person shooter. I know in the lore, Dune is much more about melee weapons, but Dune Awakening is going to have a mix of all of these elements, and it seems like the shooting is a bit more polished and just seems better in general than the melee does. It still doesn't look top of the industry or anything like that, but it looks quite a bit better than the melee combat, which I think may be a little bit under passable, and I think the shooting is probably a bit above passable. So if you're more into shooting, or if shooting just ends up being what's significantly better in the game in general, that'll probably be better for the game until they get around to polishing or kind of overhauling the melee combat more. The shooting just generally looks better. It may be something that's just easier to do because it's kind of just following normal third-person shooting. You don't have to have this more unique mechanic of having a slow blade to penetrate shielding, and then you'll have a bunch of different weapons from las guns in the end game to kind of just base pistols that primarily shoot darts to poison darts to try to penetrate a shield and then poison the enemy inside, so it just keeps doing damage to the enemy within that shield. So there is going to be a good amount of different weapons when it comes to ranged weapons, which also another reason why I think they probably put more work into it, because they could just do more with ranged weapons and allow you to take on combat at much different ranges depending on what type of different weapon you're actually using. And weapons are just generally going to be better when you're in the really big open world combat of you versus other players versus maybe AI versus vehicles, all that type of stuff. Weapons generally work better with. So that's another reason why I think the ranged shooting combat does seem to just be a bit better than the melee. And I think the third rung of the base combat is actually abilities. And I think the ability portion of combat actually looks the best. A lot of the abilities look pretty cool. A good chunk of the animations I've seen look much better than a lot of the melee animations. Some of the skills that are also kind of melee focused skills still look a bit jank like the melee does in general. There are also a lot of different skills that do a lot of different things, including a bunch of different movement skills to riposte melee attacks. You even have things like being able to res your allies, because as I mentioned, you can have two kind of base skills that you can use any mix and match of skills you want. And then you have a third skill slot, which is only for these kind of ultimate skills at the end of the skill tree. One of them we've seen basically just allows you to res your allies. So it seems like those skills are going to be really strong. And then a bunch of the base skills we have seen are also really strong. You have things like the voice where you can try to basically control your enemies. One of them brings your enemies to you. So if you wanted to be like a melee focused person, you could do that and then have that voice skill to try to pull people towards you. There's other voice skills that seem to be CC focused, but they do need to be in line of sight. You're going to have range weapon skills. You're going to have a skill tree that's completely focused on different melee abilities. You even have skills that just increase your movement speed, that just allow you to move much faster while draining your stamina. So there are a lot of different skills and they seem much more polished than some of the other combat elements. And I do think that mix of melee, range, and abilities will actually make the combat not feel horrible. And for me personally, I'm probably just going to try to focus on more range abilities because they just generally seem much better. I'm sure at some point in the future, if this game continues years down the road, that they'll probably have some overhaul for melee, because melee does kind of feel like the odd one out. Everything else feels passable or above passable. Melee feels kind of below that bar. Does also seem that the majority of the combat in the game can still kind of just be done by abilities and ranged weapons, but we'll have to see how that all plays out. Now, while this video is primarily focused on the base player combat, vehicle combat is also going to play a pretty big role, especially as you get further into the game, and especially as you get into the deep desert and get into the big PvP combat, because you're going to have flying vehicles, you're going to have ground vehicles like tanks, faster bikes, some vehicles that could be used more as troop transport. So you're going to have a bunch of different possible vehicles, all with the module system where you could put on different weapons or maybe different armor or all those different types of things. So vehicles are going to play a pretty big role there. And I do think vehicles, from everything I've seen, looks to be some of the best combat in the game. It just looks like the most well-developed, the most fluid, and will probably be pretty fun, especially with those elements of being able to change out modules to have different weapon systems and change out how the vehicles perform. So with all of that being said, I do think the base character combat is probably going to be one of the weaker parts of the game. As I mentioned, that's more down to the melee combat and maybe a bit of the shooter combat, because even though the shooter combat looks quite a bit better than the melee, it still doesn't look super super good by any means. It's a bit above passable. I think the abilities look best out of those. And then I think you have the vehicle combat that may be a bit above everything else. So if you're somebody that rates the combat much more highly above everything else in survival games, maybe you want to wait a bit for Dune Awakening to be released, for reviews to come out, to see how the actual base combat is feeling for a lot of other players. Me personally, I've played all the other survival games. None of them really have that great of combat, and I still put ridiculous amounts of time into them. So I don't think the base combat will be that big of an issue for me personally. But that's all I want to go over. So thanks for watching.